It's been another week that's heavy on the heart. Friday. More than 1,033,000 COVID cases worldwide. More than 54,000 deaths. And it has come to our congregation. A heavy heart. 94 million Americans out of work. The economy collapsing. A heavy heart. Refrigerated trucks to be temporary morgues. Field hospitals. FEMA orders 100,000 body bags. A heavy heart. Domestic violence hotlines surge with calls from people who in quarantine cannot escape to save their lives. A heavy heart. The dying cannot be comforted at the bedside as they struggle to breathe their last breaths. The grieving cannot gather to mourn. A heavy heart. Half of the planet is on lockdown. This is a litany of lament of biblical proportion. The Greek statesman Solon said, "Myth is not about something that never happened. It's about something that happens over and over again." In the Jewish and Christian traditions, this is a week of telling important stories. Stories that happen over and over again. Plagues, the deaths of innocents, betrayal, loss, freedom, renewal, love, hard-won hope, and victory, at least for a time. Stories we learn, stories we live, stories we live through. On Wednesday evening, the Jewish festival of Passover begins. The Hebrew word Magid means to tell the story. It is the same word root in the word Haggadah. The Haggadah is the book read at the Seder dinner, a weighty yet joyous story of the Exodus, of the journey from Jews as slaves in Egypt to freedom. It's a story told in prayer, song, and symbolic food. In the Seder, we don't just retell the story of the Israelites' Exodus. We come to see ourselves in the story. We remember, we become. Egypt was known as Mitzrayim, the Hebrew word that means the narrow place, the place that squeezes the breath out. How fitting for this week. No place is always Mitzrayim, but any place, even our own, can become Mitzrayim, especially now, this time of heavy hearts. The Pharaoh's heart too was heavy, not with heartbreak nor compassion, but kaved, the Hebrew word for heavy, closed off, impervious, resistant, immovable. The Israelites were slaves, making bricks in the hot sun for Pharaoh's buildings. And I imagine amidst the pyramids that the workers were never paid. I imagine a glittering glass tower with the letters P-H-A-R-A-O-H on the side. Moses, the divinely appointed union negotiator, asked for freedom. In response, Pharaoh, his heart, kaved, ordered the taskmasters to no longer provide straw for the Israelites to make bricks. Now they were to gather straw and make as many bricks as before, or be subject to torture. The Pharaoh's heart was stiffened, hardened. The text says this 20 times to convey the point that he became unresponsive to reason and incapable of compassion. The Haggadah reminds us that Egypt was destroyed because it showed no concern for human beings. And so any nation that mistreats its people and does not care about human suffering will eventually be destroyed, if even by its own doing. A nation that doesn't provide basic human rights, health care, food, water, that pays the palace of the Pharaoh with the wages of the worker cannot long stand. Plagues are visited upon the Egyptians: blood, frogs, lice, wild beasts, cattle disease, boils, hail, locusts, darkness. But the Pharaoh was not moved, his heart heavy, kaved, immovable. That wasn't till the last plague. The 10th and final plague has always horrified and perplexed me: the slaying of the firstborn. From the Pharaoh to the Egyptian slave girl, the text said, the animals of veneration and the beasts of burden, no one would be spared. This is a plague that would visit every home. The slaying of the firstborn does not discriminate between race, class, nor education, nor does coronavirus. In the story and in the Seder dinner, there's an impulse to run from that moment, and from this one, to cling to the belief that innocents never suffer. It is that plague, and this one, that lifts the veil on the injustice built into the very foundation of our American temples. It is a novel virus that refracts our gaze to stark clarity, to see the fragility of our social safety net, our healthcare system, the human body. It is now that we read of people who have lived here, in the wealthiest country in the world, without water running in their homes. It is now that universal health care seems not only reasonable, but required. Prisoners are released, debts are frozen. It was only by a plague that came to his own son in his own home that the Pharaoh, who thought himself God, let the Israelites go. Prisoners released. That plague, the slaying of the firstborn, was to happen in the dark of the night. The Talmud says, "And not one of you shall leave the threshold of his house till morning." Thus, the Israelites were instructed to be under stay-at-home orders, while the angel of death traveled from house to house. Before that night, the Israelites were instructed to sacrifice a lamb. They were to roast it, eat it, and mark their doorposts with blood, so that the angel of death would pass over their homes as they remained quarantined inside. Death would pass over. Pesach, the root of our English word Paschal. But the Hebrew word Pesach also means this: to have compassion, to protect. Their sacrifice of staying in their homes would protect them. And it will protect you. But here we come to another puzzling part of the story. Why does the angel of death need to know who's who? Wouldn't the angel of death, of all beings, know who is slave and who is free? Who is rich and who is poor? Who is Egyptian and who is Israelite? Perhaps there's far greater wisdom here. Death is blind. Death knows no distinction of class, race, subjugation, or occupation. Death is the original equal opportunity employer with whom we each have an appointment, even if we don't yet know the time. The Israelites were to mark their doorposts with blood of the lamb so that the angel of death would pass over. One Jewish commentary suggests that they were to mark their doorposts on the inside. By marking their doors, the mark was for them to know who they were. It was for them to remember to stay inside. It was the safest place to be. It was for them to remember they were a people of dignity, waiting for that moment to break free of their home quarantine, their bondage, ready to make haste at a moment's notice, to grab bread for the journey before it even had time to rise. Mark your hearts. Mark your doors, so you remember who you are. Fast forward about 1,500 years. Passover, as the story of Exodus, has been celebrated for about 60 generations by this point. Now Jerusalem is occupied by the Romans, and the Romans appointed Jewish authorities to rule over their local jurisdictions. Now this is an interesting double bind. The Jewish authorities must demonstrate to Roman rule that they can control and govern their people, or they risk losing the ability to rule their people at all. And not unlike Chicago, on occasion power begets corruption, and often the powerful benefit when the poor are left with very little. It was those powerful Jewish rulers, a very small minority, who were in smoke-filled rooms with the Romans. Those were the Jews Jesus was protesting. And here's what we know. The historical Jesus was a manual laborer, a carpenter. He was born to undocumented immigrants, an unwed teenage mother. He escaped genocide, and he didn't settle down and have a respectable career, but instead became an itinerant rabbi. He wandered around with the outcasts of his society. And he started community organizing, the original one-on-one conversations. He built powerful networks of poor people, tax collectors, and sex workers. He organized networks of poor people who questioned the ruling powers, and this was not a recipe for personal safety nor social stability. Some things in our world, people of goodwill must be maladjusted. The tension between Jesus and his followers and the powers that be grew and grew and grew. He was 33. They told him, "You look awfully young to be a minister." He said he did an internship with John the Baptist. They said, "Okay, preach." He was 33. The time for the Passover festival had come, and the Jews were to journey to Jerusalem to celebrate at the temple. And he was a community organizer, and I want you to think that he was bringing his people to the March on Washington. And the day arrived, today, Palm Sunday. In Luke's account, as Jesus approaches Jerusalem, he looks over the city and he weeps. I imagine him holding the city in his eyes, like when you come in for a landing in Midway Airport and you can see the lake, you can see the skyscrapers glittering, and knowing the untold suffering, the unknown joys, the corruption, the possibility, the lives of all the people of the city. Jesus weeps. The rulers could have ruled differently. They could have provided for everyone. There had been enough, after all. The Romans could have ordered surgical masks rather than downplaying a deadly virus. They could have supported a $200 million pandemic warning program rather than shutting it down in the fall. They could have strengthened services to the poor because it was the right thing to do, rather than benefit the wealthy. There had been enough, after all. And so Jesus enters Jerusalem on a donkey. He rides in on a donkey to reference a scripture from the prophet Zechariah. Now think of it like this. He was playing with a pop culture reference that everyone would get. He rides on a donkey not because it was convenient, but to be political. He was not a Roman warrior returning victorious on a war horse. He was a homeless community organizer. The crowds got it. They play along. They lay down palms and their cloaks. This is what you're supposed to do when the war hero comes to town. The people were lampooning the Roman rulers. Think of this Palm Sunday less like an Anglican church procession and more like Occupy Wall Street. All at once, the poor, ready to celebrate a festival of freedom, have a moment to mock the ruling class. They mock the Romans. They mock the Jews in power that were appointed by the Romans. And they also honor Jesus, and they say, this man said our lives matter. Jesus is smart. He knows what's coming. He rides into Jerusalem like Dr. King checks into the Lorraine Motel. The exact moment may not be known, but the danger is unmistakable. He is a wanted man. He dismounts from his donkey and he walks towards Good Friday. And so do we. He walks to an upper room and he celebrates Passover with his friends. Megid. They tell the story. He's betrayed in the night. He's executed by the state on the next day, Good Friday. Myth is not about something that never happened. It's about something that happens over and over again. Good Friday, the death of innocence, exploitation by the powerful, the inescapability of suffering, the certainty of death, the sorrow of loss. There's an impulse to run from that moment and from this one. We are walking towards Good Friday. The president says, I want every American to be prepared for the hard days that lie ahead. We're going to go through a very tough 2 weeks. I agree with very little that the president says, but in this respect, he is right. The number of US deaths could range from 100,000 to 240,000, even with the stay-at-home orders. Our hearts are heavy. Let us weep for our city with compassion. We are walking toward Good Friday, even if 6 feet apart. Megid, tell the story. We are commanded to tell the story of liberation as if we were a part of it, as if it's not someone else's story but our own, because ultimately it is true. In this spirit, we see ourselves as participants in the Exodus, and we must dedicate our energies to the cause there begun, because we have not just been freed from, we have been freed for. It is said, whoever enlarges the story of the Exodus is praiseworthy. We will not get to the promised land without passing first through the desert, through Good Friday. But I can say this, Good Friday is never the end of the story. We know not if nor when our people, our society, our world, ourselves will come out the other side. Maybe there's not quite another side to come out of. Some of us will not make it. But I can say this, Good Friday never has the final word. There is always spring, there is always rebirth, there is always Easter, even if we know not the day on the calendar nor the hour. But for this week, hold your hearts tenderly. Let yourself weep for your city, that our hearts not become kaved, heavy, but heavy with compassion. As you do so, you will be given the Paschal blessing of compassion. And may you know these Paschal blessings too. May you be protected, and may this pass over you. May the sacrifices you make now for your loved ones and for society mark the doors to your heart, so you remember who you are and who you are for. And may we be for one another, now and in all the days to come. Amen.